welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. I'm here with two JFK researchers, Bart, Kamp, and Paul. Abbott, it's a pleasure to have you both gentlemen on the show. We're going to be talking about Oswald's last 48 hours. We specifically, me, Paul, and Gil talked about last time was the Dallas police and a lot of corrupted activities, especially with stuff regarding Ruby shooting Oswald in the basement. But this, I wanted to focus on Oswald's particular last 48 hours, some of his interrogation stuff, and just some names that pop up that obviously we can draw a correlation to examples of corrupted activities. Paul, if you want to introduce yourself first, and then Bart, we'll have you introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi Robbie, and good to be with you, Bart. So I'm Paul Abbott. I've been researching the JFK assassination for 30 years or so, very interested in it, but I've gotten more serious about it recently. I compiled the index on the Garrison files, and that led me to a particular topic that I'm been very deeply diving into the last year or so, and that's Oswald's shooting. So Jack Ruby shooting Oswald at the beginning of his transfer to the county jail. So that's led me to look into a lot of the DPD characters that were there that Sunday morning, and just the various narratives that took place. It turns out that it was a very busy and interesting time. In terms of down in the basement at City Hall, in the lead up to Oswald's delayed transfer. So that's what brings me here.
My name is Bart Kamp. I'm originally from the Netherlands. I reside in London. I got interested in the JFK assassination before the Stone film. I read a few articles here and there, and I always was fascinated by it a bit, but it was the Stone film that really turned the pilot light into a sort of a flame. I read two of the books the film was based on, and then with the internet, I started looking around, but there's too much conspiracy blather, and I just went, you know what, enough's enough. I'm gonna quit, and that's what I did for about 12 or so years, and then I got tired of social media and just started reading books instead. And I was like, right, what am I going to read? Yeah, I was reading a few Kennedy books, so I read RFK and JFK assassination related books. Did about 20 or 30 of them, and then became part of Dealey Plaza UK. This is about 10 years ago. And then met fellow researchers, and I got into it deeper after I left a job and I was bored, and I basically started reading into things and find out and about the documentation, and that slowly got going for the next 2-3 years. And then I started writing a paper, which is called Anatomy of the Second Floor Lunchroom Encounter, which was at that time 80 pages thick, but at the end it almost doubled in size, and it was just about the second floor lunchroom encounter. I slowly started to get more and more into documentation, cataloging it, and basically I just see it as a giant puzzle and putting pieces in here and there. Then in 2016, I met Malcolm Blunt for the first time, and in 2018, in the October, he gave me access to archive of Harry Livingston, and I basically started plowing through that and reading about it. And then a few months later, I got access to his own personal archive, which was humongous. This is at least 25 to 30 4-drawer cabinet files, just filled to the brim with Xerox paper, all disorganized. So I had to go through all of it, basically scan them all in and categorize them as such. So that was the Malcolm Blunt archive. I did release that. And at the same time, in 2014, I saw about Prayer Man, and as a photographer, I recognized right away that that's Oswald. There's no argument there. And of course, over the years, I've been trying to find the evidence that supports the case that it is Oswald, standing outside on the landing, or just one step below, of the front steps of the Texas School Book Depository. By going through all that material, I found a narrative that explained everything in the finest details, and also how things were done in those days from a paperwork point of view, and bureaucracy itself. And over the years, just basically scanning things in and reading about it, and basically managed to put a sort of like a rough chronology together based on the evidence. And that's when I released the book. 2 years ago, I released 4 papers, and Malcolm Blunt saw my interrogations paper, and he said, "You should do a book." And I was like, "Oh, thanks a lot. I just released this a week ago, and you're telling me now to do a book. Thanks a fucking lot." And so I did that, and I took a few months break, and then I started researching what was missing in between. I was like, well, what else have we got going on? And then I found a couple of startling things. I'll get back to that about that later. But so in a way, I'm thankful that he made me do that, because I found things out that normally wouldn't have come to light based on solely on the evidence as such. And so I released a book last year, and it's been going okay. I can't fault it. The way it's been received and so forth. It's got pretty good reviews on Amazon. So yeah, that's me.
And I don't want to focus too much on Oswald leaving the TSBD and then his arrest. I want to kind of focus a lot more on what the activities were in the Dallas police basement, because obviously that's areas that I think we all have come in contact with at a certain point. But you guys have probably heard a lot, and it's probably been used as evidence against Oswald, that he was the only person that left the TSBD. He wasn't on the roll call list. He was the only employee, which gives major suspicion that he was fleeing from a crime scene. And I think that based on witness testimony, a lot of others, there's a lot more than just one individual that left and didn't come back. There's plenty of witnesses that went out to go see the presidential motorcade around whatever noon to have lunch or something like that, were with other people, and decided just not to return to work. So I wanted to ask you guys your thoughts on that, and if you had any examples that you would like to give on certain individuals that also left the TSBD.
Well, when it comes to the people leaving, there are some photographs of police officers that were taking names down. And those handwritten notes have never been seen nor published. There is a list, which is referred to the Revel list, which is from the Criminal Intelligence Division. And Jack Revel was part of that, and we call it that list because I think it's got his signature on the bottom, or it was addressed to him. And in that list, it's a 2-page typed up list, and on the very top, the first line is Lee Harvey Oswald's name, and these are basically the names of the people that were present inside the Texas School Book Depository at that time, wanting to leave the Texas School Book Depository. So, and we know that the police didn't set up shop at least 15 minutes, 20 minutes later. And then, first of all, ascertain what's happening in the building, lock the exits off, although we can debate that. But, and then also basically have to take names. And of course, before that command comes down, you're talking at least 15 minutes later from the moment that he was assassinated. JFK was assassinated. So there's Oswald on the top of the list, which of course begs the question, how come that's the case? Well, my take is Oswald was the first one to leave that building, and he went very, very quickly. And I think I'm basically also convinced by Roger Craig's observation of him getting into that Nash Rambler and seeing him coming down the ramp and the hill and just basically run down into that car and get in there and drive straight to the Texas Theater for this confrontation with the Dallas police after that. The whole Tippett episode, which I don't address because I don't think he was there at all. So that's the thing. And Beckley, I've got a problem with as well. That's another thing. That's really dubious. But, it is what it is. The list shows, it's really cool because it shows also the arrival of people. So certain people weren't going back in until 2:30, 3 o'clock. Lord Viles was one of them, at the top of my head. Some people basically, as you said as well, they didn't come back at all after the assassination, didn't make an attempt, because by the time they got back, it was cordoned off by the cops and nobody was allowed to get in or to get out. There's film footage of Billy Lovelady and Danny Garcia and Bonnie Ray Williams standing on those steps trying to get in. and Billy Lovelady is seen smoking a cigarette really quickly if you look at the GIF. And that was roughly around 5-1, and nobody was let in at all. And that is only like shortly after that they slowly let people in, because there was probably somebody vouching for them so they could get back in as an employee, and so they were allowed to go back in. That's how that went. And that was just before 1 o'clock. There's no exact timing on it, but it was considerably after the assassination itself. That list is so important because Oswald's on top of it, yeah. So they basically took his details. How else are they going to get his details? Because you were meant to leave the details at the front desk, at the front door, and the cops would take it down. That was that. You know, and this is also, by the way, really good evidence that certain people in the Dallas police weren't in the fix or the corruption circle. They just basically wrote that document as it is. If it was a real fix, Oswald's name would have be nowhere on that list at all. You know, it would have been hidden right there and then. So,
Okay, Westbrook was running around all over Dallas between the Tippett scene and the theatre and everything, chasing after Oswald, as it would seem, or trying to lay the trail to him at the Texas Theatre. So I don't think he possibly could have been on top of that either. So that, yeah, I agree.
it's just that list. It's also interesting to see because they had a criminal intelligence division had a file on Ruth Dean. So it doesn't say that explicitly, but it says that because it has a certain code on it, and that basically means that they got a file on her. You know?
Who was that, Bart? Sorry, Ruth.
Sorry?
What was that name, sorry?
Ruth Dean.
Ruth Dean.
Ruth Dean, yeah.
She's the lady in the black outfit on the steps that was first mistakenly identified as Sarah Stanton. Sarah Stanton was short and overweight and stood further back to the right. So, but yeah, that list is just full on and really good example of that. Oswald left as a first in that building, and just simple mathematics goes like, you didn't set up shop for 15 minutes at least. You know, you went in at like 7-8 minutes, but then you need time to organize. You need to shut the place down, allegedly, and then you've basically got to make sure that all these employees are supposed to leave their name and their details. And that's when also the so-called roll call comes in. An actual roll call never happened. Were some names taken down by Roy Truly or Bill Shelley? Probably, yeah. But a real roll call wasn't possible because people were still outside the building. And by the way, why is it that the only people that are of interest to the Dallas police are the manual workers? I mean, a guy in a suit could have shot at JFK. So you should have just said, like, right. And even in these days you say all men and women inside the building all get vetted and questioned before they go out, and that's it. But back then, what? Because he's a worker and that's it? But management or any of the representatives of the book clubs, those book publishing companies couldn't have done that as such. So you know what? If you go like that and just basically corner Oswald there and then already, just trying to keep it like that. But at the same time, when you look at the evidence and then up the timings of the people coming back, and you go, well, this doesn't hit any nails at all, because it's just, there's so much wrong with this. The whole roll call itself, I mean, a few people have attested to it, like we were asked. And of course, some of the manual workers, the laborers, they were working on the first floor, which is up the steps and then that floor. It's not the ground floor, but that's the first floor. So they would gather around there anyway. So when they start taking names, and then all of a sudden Oswald is missing. But Charles Douglas Givens was missing as well at the same time, you know? And it's by the time that the cops are actually about to enter the Texas Theater is when the DPD has a full-on description of Charles Douglas Givens. And the funny bit with that connection is, yet they didn't have a proper description of Oswald. You see, if Oswald was missing at that time, and they say, yo, man, he's gone, we need to catch him, blah, 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 the full-on description could have gotten from Roy Truly straight onto the cops, straight onto the radio, and it would have gotten out there.
I want to say in Johnny Calvin Brewer's oral history interview that he gave, when he was asked to recount his description, obviously this had been years later, but he could not pin down what description they gave for Oswald that he heard on the radio. Really, if you examine his oral history, he doesn't sound like he really just saw someone walk into a store, stand and look at some clothing while cop cars went by, and then walk to the Texas Theater. Dude didn't run. He walked into the Texas Theater. Julia Postal didn't say anything about him not purchasing a ticket. She didn't even notice him there. She was paying attention to something else. Johnny Calvin Brewer took it on himself to go in there, even though he lied in his original statement saying Julia Postal told me to go in there. He didn't get a positive idea. This is the guy. I know it's 100%. I mean, he had a hunch and did that. That's why there's this incident where there's another Oswald in the balcony, a look-alike type person. We don't have to get into all that, but there's obviously conflicting statements on descriptions. That's why there's two other people that were arrested that same, before Oswald was officially announced as the killer of Tippit and the killer of President Kennedy. There's Donald Wainhouse, and there's another one. There's a total of 3 that I've seen at least so far that have been arrested for suspected of being a suspect of the assassin of Kennedy.
I'd rather have what's his name from the shoe store? Sorry, his name just
Johnny Calvin Brewer, man.
Johnny Calvin Brewer. Tell us all, what were those 2 IBM employees doing inside his shop?
That's a good one.
Now it's time for conspiracy hour.
But didn't Oswald get to the theatre at 1:08? Didn't Butch Burroughs testify to that? Which was well and truly before Brewer saw whoever he saw.
If you take Brewer's statement, he says Burroughs says that he was behind the counter stocking some things. He actually didn't see Oswald come in, so he completely negates Burroughs' testimony and statement. That was in his oral history interview, which I was like, I don't know. I would probably believe more of Burroughs, even though a lot of people toss his testimony out. Because Oswald didn't seem like, I don't know. He had money on him, I'm pretty sure. He had a lot of wallets, not enough to fill them all, but there was definitely a point where he definitely probably might have bought concessions.
I'm really wary of the oral history interviews because they're done obviously so long after the fact, and the bunch of videos that I've watched of people in regards to witnesses of Oswald's shooting. So a lot of journalists who didn't speak at the time, you didn't get any kind of, they weren't even spoken to by the DPD, some not even acknowledged, nor of course the FBI or the Warren Commission. We only hear of their accounts, people like Peggy Simpson and Carl King, people like that, so many years after the fact in the oral history interviews, and they're just, I think they're almost worthless. I get why the museum has to do it. It's a prosperity project, of course, but in terms of if we're going to count Brewer's oral history interview versus what he said at the time, I don't think the two really compare. It should be what they said at the time should hold more weight, I would have thought.
Well, this kind of circles still into the 48 hours thing, but I sent this to you, Paul, which was some of those oral history interviews, like Harold B. Holly Jr., C.M. Barnhart, and G.E. Worley. 2 of them had testified that Tom Howard was in the basement before the Oswald shooting, which was very suspicious because they're reserved officers, but they weren't interviewed by the Warren Commission. Maybe they got an FBI documentation, but then there was information that was provided by the Dallas Police Department about information they did not furnish, which some people recalled later about describing a person that somewhat fit Jack Ruby's description in the basement. But obviously, there's a little bit of conflicts of how he even got to the basement. Some of them, when they were talking about it, they're like, I don't see Vaughn letting him in the basement. He had to get in some other way. But then they wouldn't describe how Ruby could have even been associated to go in there. But the Tom Howard thing is weird. Was he alerting Ruby to when Oswald was going to be transferred?
Well, it wasn't just the reserve officers that saw him there. It was detectives Homer McGee and Reynolds, H. Barron Reynolds. They testified to the FBI that they saw Tom Howard in the seconds as late as when apparently Oswald was coming out of the elevator. And Howard himself, he told the FBI that he got as far as pushing the button of the elevator to go up to the 5th floor to see someone being detained up there. So even Howard said it, but after those initial testimonies for the DPD investigation, and of course the FBI, which was running concurrently, nothing heard of. So I'm interested to know that Worley even testified to that, because he was there in the basement for until about 10:45 before he was moved out from guarding the eastern end of the basement car park. So interesting to know how he would know that Howard was there, because he was gone away from the scene for
That's the one who said he was at Parkland Hospital, right?
only after the shooting. Because what happened was people were set out on the patrol officers were assigned to intersections that the Oswald's convoy was presumed to travel along to the county jail. So a lot of the reserve officers were also assigned to help the patrol officers. So
because G.E. Worley was at Parkland Hospital, and an unidentified reserve officer had informed him about Tom Howard being there.
no, that was Harold Holly.
Harold Holly?
Holly was
Might be getting
told
confused.
about. But no, all reserve officers, all patrol officers were all told to get to Parkland. They were more worried about guarding Oswald mortally injured than they were alive, clearly.
I want to bring it back to what we were originally talking about with obviously the second floor lunchroom encounter, Bart, you were mentioning earlier. I'm having conflicting problems because if you look at the very first interrogation with Oswald, and they ask him that question about your name's Lee Harvey Oswald, and they're asking him what he was doing and being at the Texas School Book Depository, he mentions that he was on the second floor eating his lunch.
No,
Are you sure? That
he said he
draft I
got a
sent you does?
he said he got a Coke for his lunch.
Okay, that's okay.
That's what Oswald said. What Fritz says is from the land of fairy tales. It's a bullshit report, that statement.
This is what I want to get into, because the interrogation part, he had like 3 or 4 of them. We got to get into that.
He had 5 or 6, if I'm not mistaken. And if you want to count, the 7th one is when he actually is lying on the operating table when FBI agents are wearing gowns, shouting at him, "Did you kill the president?"
Confess.
Yeah, yes, exactly. They were shouting at him just while he was there groaning away and basically blowing out his last breath. So that's, I think, the 7th one. The 6th, the first day, 5 before. The first day he did 3. And the next day he did 2 or 3. No, did 2, and then he did another one on Sunday. So that's 6, if I'm not mistaken. So the first one is, of course, pivotal of all of them, because this is where Oswald's alibi gets destroyed, and also at the same time where the second floor lunchroom encounter is being created as such.
So who was in the first interrogation? It was Hosty, Bookout, and Fritz?
It starts with Fritz and Elmer Boyd. And Richard Sims, he's also there. Then we don't know what time it started. It is anything between 2:30 and 3 o'clock. What we know is that Hosty and Bookout arrive at 3:15. That's noted. And that's when Hosty starts writing down a few notes. And these are all notes like words, almost like bullet points, but not even a sentence, just a phrase here and there. And at first, that was very hard to decipher in this, as in, what are the answers to what questions and so forth. And it only became clearer later on in my investigation that I saw the significance of it. What Hosty does after that particular interrogation, which lasts from for the 5 of them, 3:15 to 4 o'clock, because that's when he goes off to the Helen Markham lineup. And in those 45 minutes, Oswald basically states where he was. And he said he was outside watching the presidential parade. In the Wolf Fritz notes that came out in 97, if I'm not mistaken, or late 96, it says that he was outside in front with Bill Shelley. How did Oswald know that he was outside? next to Bill Shelley. How did he know that Bill Shelley was standing there outside in front of the Texas School Book Depository? How did he know that? Only because he'd seen him. And of course, there's no more other questions about that, who else was there, etc., etc. When Oswald is being interrogated, and it stops at 4 o'clock. Now, this part is speculation, but it's a bit of common sense will tell you, yeah, that's most likely happened. And that's the fact that the FBI agents are calling headquarters. Headquarters, so when they call them, they know what the jig is with the whole thing, what he said, where he was during the shooting. At that time, when they make that phone call, they make a decision in headquarters to talk to Nat Pinkston, who needs to go to the Texas School Book Depository. And he starts talking about elements like the rifles that were seen by Oswald. Of that first interrogation, there are certain characteristics, specifics, that Nat Pinkston asks Roy Truly. Now, Roy Truly was in the Texas School Book Depository that afternoon. He was looking after the place. And Pinkston sits down with him. And this is when the document that basically the second floor lunchroom encounter is invented as such. And this, of course, is a total problem comparing it with the first statement of Marion Baker at that point. Because Truly talks about the second floor. Baker talks about apprehending someone on the third and the fourth floor. But it gets better and better. There's more statements coming, and all of a sudden the whole story is basically being massaged together to a really nice sexed up story where you basically, oh yeah, this is how it happened, and everybody will start just repeating it like a mantra. And then there are like 3 or 4 statements coming in those days, all supporting this so-called second floor lunchroom encounter. But if you look at the interrogation notes, Oswald gave him the idea because he got a Coke for his lunch.
So they just assumed.
No, yes, but it gets better. Because here's the thing. The notes taken from that first interrogation, plus the joint report by James Bookout and James Hosty, together, the first report, makes mention of him getting a drink for his lunch, not after. Lunch, right, was at 12. Okay? So at 12, when they went down just before that, they basically got themselves a drink and went down to drink that downstairs in the domino room, because upstairs in the lunchroom, yeah, a lot of people keep claiming all kinds of fairy tales, but the lunchroom upstairs was for the people from floors 2 to 6, 2 to 5, 2 to 4. And basically that was office personnel, not laborers in their sweaty clothing and so forth. So management and office workers would be on the second floor lunchroom. Workers could go in there to get a drink and then go down. Bill Frazier has attested to it that they needed to get permission to go upstairs if they wanted to talk to somebody up there. Or Bill Shelley gave him permission to go up there to check out the pretty girls. That Frazier said this on 2 occasions as such. And that just shows you that the second floor overall was off limits. You can get a drink and then buzz off right there and then go down. And from the stairs, since that entrance to that lunchroom is very near to the stairs, it would just be a matter of 2 flights of stairs going down and go around the corner and see the domino room 30 feet away from that. It was absolutely nothing. And that's the interesting part about it, because at first you're looking at the physical elements of it and what the people are saying, and you go, but that doesn't rhyme at all. When you look at the distances of the actual landing and the steps going up, and Roy Truly stated, I was on the second and the third step and I looked back and the door was closed. Oh yeah? Do you know how long that door took to close? At least 3 to 5 seconds, because it was on these door release handle things. Some people call it a pneumatic door, but I think that's a bit rich. But it's just one of those things that is auto closer. And that's basically what it was. And then you had about 5-6 feet to walk through, which was this tiny little corridor. And then you went through the door opening of the actual lunchroom itself. The funny part is that Baker says he stood on the landing and he saw somebody going past. Well, the door that opens up is at 45-degree angle. It's so tiny, that hole. And by the way, to see somebody go past, well, you know what? That would actually say in first instances that he must have come from the first floor. So if he's from the first floor, he didn't come from the sixth floor. But they make it sound like he was ahead of them and he went through the door and the door was open when he went through and then it closed behind him. And Baker didn't see that door closing. Yeah. And then on top of that, Roy Truly looked back, saw a closed door, and Baker was gone, allegedly. And this door, I'm telling you, look at the Secret Service movie, the reenactment of the Secret Service film, and you see that door and you just sit there with a stopwatch and go, no way, this is not happening. And that's just the physical element of it. If you then start basically ripping all the reports apart and just look at the chronology of it, how the story has been developed. And when you take Fritz's notes into consideration and when you take the Bookout Hosty report, then the whole thing gets done a 180. Because James Bookout writes a report on the day of Oswald's shot dead, he writes another report and he does a complete 180 on the whole encounter and basically repeats what Nat Pinkston and Roy Truly had concocted at that point. There is no other explanation for it. It's just a total 180. There are 3 instances in that report where you go, nah, no way. He completely said the opposite in the first report. And that's when Hosty was there as well. And then at 2019, I find the book, the Hosty report, which is a handwritten note, which is a page, which is written on the back of Dallas PD affidavit paper. And Hosty basically says in his book, this is the beauty of it, he describes it. And he says that after the interrogations, he went into the other room, which I think was Walter Potter's room, if I'm not mistaken. And he goes in there and he grabs a blank block of DPD affidavit notes because the back was blank. Of course, it was pre-typed and printed, of course. So you just tear one out and you give it to the witness to make a statement. But he used the back and he starts writing on this stuff. And I use that same paper, starts making a pre-report. And in that pre-report, it says that he was outside watching the presidential parade. That's not repeated anywhere. All they do is say he was on the first floor when the car went by.
Well,
that's what they say.
It would match the vice president of the TSBD's statement where he said, what's his name, Virgil Campbell, where he stated that he saw Oswald on the first floor. Yeah.
AUKUS Virgil Campbell. Yeah. No. In the room, which is just around the corner when you go through the glass door. On the right was a little utility room. Yeah, but he's been recognized by other people. So there.
Paul, you wanted to say something? I saw you.
No. I'll probably jump back to. I'm interested in Carolyn Arnold. Bart, you wrote about her in your book. She said it was 12:15 that she last saw Oswald in the domino room before the shooting.
No, it's lunch, not. Allegedly. No, that's incorrect. Carolyn Arnold is a very interesting person because her statement was taken on the 26th, and she stated in that FBI statement that she looked back and thought she saw Oswald standing between the glass doors. And what people need to understand is that you have the top of the stairs, then that's where the first floor starts. Then you have a glass door, which is part of a 3-paneled glass panel door, basically. These panels are fixed. And then you go in, and there's another glass door. There's a set of doors from where you go into the shipping area, and where Roy Truly and Bill Shelley had his offices. And she thought she had seen that she thought Oswald or somebody who looked like him in between those doors. That statement is, well, I wouldn't say it's brushed aside. It's not swept under the carpet, but it's aside. When they want the original statement, Harold Weisberg went for that. They didn't they couldn't find it. Now, what else makes it really Caroline Arnold very interesting is because in the Wiegman film, she's looking towards the Daltex building. And this is really important because there's also Patricia, I forgot her last name, and she was in a video with Max Holland. And when she stood there right in front of the stairs for this, I think it was around the 50th, and she just went, and when the shots were fired, and she just looks back left to the Daltex building and just goes like,
Patricia
oh,
Lawrence.
Yeah, that's it. And she just goes, and she just points to the Daltex building. I was like, and Max Holland is just nodding, and I'm going, yeah, dude, she's just saying it because in the Wiegman film, I got a still where Caroline Arnold is looking towards the Daltex building, and this is right in the middle of the shooting. This is Wiegman is about to get out of his car about, I don't know, a second or so later, and Wiegman actually also said that when he came out of the car, the force of the shot was basically hitting him face on, which proves also, like, if the shot that came from behind, I wouldn't have hit him like that. So he felt something that was coming towards him while he was running on the pavement of the northern side of Elm Street as such. I could go on for hours.
Do you remember when it was discussed what Oswald exactly ate for lunch? Because he did talk about having like a sandwich or something like that. But obviously there's been, I don't know if you know what interrogation that was, but there's obviously been conflicting things where like there's a bag of chicken bones up at the 6th floor.
That's with the 5th floor gang, Bonnie Ray Williams.
Yeah.
Oswald had a sandwich. He had it in his sandwich bag. And the funny thing is that there's photos of the front steps of the Texas School Book Depository from around 1:30, 2 o'clock, when Fritz is leaving and where others are standing inside the hallway. And there's a bottle standing on the step where Prayer Man is standing now. And with that bottle is also a lunch sack as well at the same time. Now, I say that Oswald just was in the domino room with his drink that he got upstairs from the 2nd floor, then heard all the commotion and thought, hey, what's going on? Went out there, stood there, had his drink, watching while the parade went past, and he had his lunch bag right next to it. And that's in one of the pictures obvious that the lunch bag is just standing right next to the bottle. And that bottle, who drank it? Well, Prayer Man, because for me, Prayer Man in the photography, he's like with this bottle and he sits. It's what I call a zone of transition, when the sunlight beam comes in and you're still in the shadow, but you're close to where the beam comes in. And because it's glass, it magnifies it, and that's why there's a huge highlight in that particular part of the footage. And you can't explain it with a camera, because the thing is also, it's done with one hand, it's not with two. A lot of people think it's just Prayer Man because he's holding his hands like that. It isn't. He's going like that with his hand.
So Oswald did bring a brown paper bag to work that day. Just had his lunch in it, not a rifle.
Well, that's what they bring up and then part of the interrogation too. But I want to bring it back to kind of one of the first parts of the interrogation. I'm going to read you this, Bart, and you let me know what you think about it. It says, I asked him if he owned a rifle, and he said that he did not. He said that he had seen one at the building a few days ago, and that Mr. Truly and some of the employees were looking at it. I asked him where he went to when he left work, and he told me that he had a room on 1026 North Beckley, that he went over there and changed his trousers and got a pistol and went to the picture show. I asked him why he carried his pistol, and he remarked, you know how boys do when they have a gun. They just carry it. Now, I have an issue with that ending part about him calling himself a boy and saying that they carry it. But now that statement matches a couple things. One, that's Warren Castor who brought the rifle in. I'm right about that. It's for him and his son. He had got him a Christmas present or some crap like that. He wanted to hide in the office. He ended up showing it around. Roy Truly lies that he never touched it. And then he's talking about later observing it and holding it up and looking through the scope and all that type of crap. But he mentions when he goes and changes and grabs his pistol, that would match why when they were arresting him in the Texas theater, he was saying, all I was doing, it's not illegal to carry a gun. That would match that. It would kind of exclude him from the Tippit shooting. But there's two things in there that check off two boxes with the Warren Castor stuff and then the pistol. But then there's that ending part where
I don't believe the pistol.
Like to carry.
I believe the pistol was thrown at him That's what Gus Rose said. Gus Rose said this in an article about 15, 16 years ago, something like that. And Oswald said that the pistol was thrown at him. And there was somebody else in the Texas theater, he said that as well. And, they just needed an excuse to get him. Only a few people knew about this, and the rest of it were just following orders, That's the whole thing. It's a very small club. That was
Now, how long? Now, Hosty's notes were at the ending of the ARB's kind of conclusion there. They got submitted, and no one had a really good chance to look at them and examine them. They were kind of just put into
Harold Weisberg did, but he was too angry to
Okay.
see it, to understand what was going on.
Most first-generation researchers are all
well,
angry.
basically, yeah, and called Hosty a liar, this, that, and the other, blah, blah, blah. He got his hands on it, and like everything else, he got his hands on it first. And then it went quiet, and then I found it back in 2019 in February, and I was like, and the funny thing is, like, I stood in front of all these drawers, and Malcolm, I said, where should I start? And Malcolm said, you can start wherever you want. And I was like, okay. I looked open it and grabbed this thick folder that was about 3 inches thick, and Hosty, yeah, cool. And I went through it, and then I saw that, and I was like, nah, can't be.
Bart, your mic went out.
Gold, 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 because I found it. And I was like, I can't believe I found this, because I also knew about what Hosty wrote in his book, saying, hey, I was there, I did this, I got the block of notes, blah, blah, blah. And then I saw it, and in mirror writing, basically, because it was the affidavit in any fact that is in mirrored because of the Xerox machine, because it came through. And then I just realized, oh my God, these are the Hosty notes in that room of the so-called Oswald evidence. And that evidence is so important to understand that the Heidel ID didn't exist at that time, because Hosty makes no note of that thing, makes no mention of it, nor does any DPD make a mention of it until much, much later, the next day, when the name A. Heidel is brought forward by an investigation at Klein's by the FBI early in the morning. That's when the name and the rifle order is officiated and say, oh, we've got an A. Heidel ordering this rifle. Up to that time, there's absolutely nothing to tie Oswald to the rifle. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The paraffin cast doesn't work. The fingerprints is rubbish. The palm print is a fugazi. Yeah, it's total rubbish. They can't find a palm print. Then it's handed off to the FBI. They can't find a palm print. Then it comes back to the DPD. Oh, what about that palm print? Oh, we don't know about that. No, we did that palm print, blah, blah, blah. Oh, right, hold on. Send it back to the FBI. Oh, yeah, we've got this palm print. Think about that. How do you do that? How do you do that?
You can curse if you want. You don't have to bleep yourself.
Oh, well, I basically, and I thought,
you've already done it like
unreal.
3 times.
Okay. So, but then you basically start thinking, okay, so if that's not correct, what else is there when it comes to the evidence, basically tying Oswald to the rifle? And there's absolutely nothing. I mean, you can dig like John Armstrong did in the money order and this, that, and the other. But by putting it in a chronology, it just became abundantly clear that the fingerprints, which is one of the last chapters I created for the book, that there was so much mucking around with the evidence and how they did that. And then the funny part is that the FBI comes and collects it all. Vincent Drain comes in, who's like one of Edgar Hoover's favorite boys to work for him, and he collects all the evidence, and he takes all the fingerprints and palm prints with them to Washington, because they leave at 1:45, something like that. But they have to wait till Oswald's press conference, because Oswald is still wearing his shirt, because Oswald had to go upstairs after the press conference, take his shirt off, and then the FBI would take that with them onto the plane straight to Washington to test it, forensically test it as such. So at that point, there are no fingerprints in possession. So what does the DPD do? Make a new set of fingerprints. So if you look into the UNT archives for Dallas University of North Texas, you will only find originals from early on the 23rd. There is absolutely no original present in those archives from the DPD. They're all copies, because the originals, they went with the FBI. They went straight over with everything else. And that's why I also just, you know what, it's just too flaky to come up and say, well, the palm print was there. Well, no, first of all, the palm print wasn't found. On top of that, the weapon wasn't wrapped up at all. And you know what, maybe they did it like that 61 years ago. I don't know, but it still looked careless, because other things are getting covered with cellophane. So I don't know. But the thing is that the chain of evidence, the way that rifle went from them to the FBI, and then you've got Carl Day, who was quite a force on its own when it came to fingerprinting. He was seen as an expert, but then it goes to Sebastian Lantona at the FBI, and he basically rips that rifle a new one. I'd love to see the photographs they took of that rifle that day when they got the rifle to basically on the 23rd to photograph it as such. They're not present. I'll tell you why, because if they were, it would show that there's absolutely nothing on that barrel underneath. No, it was on the stock. The stock prevented it from, yeah, right. So that's just, and then the nitrate test is the same thing. Absolutely no evidence whatsoever. People tore it apart as junk science years after as well. It was absolutely useless. Neutron activation test, same thing. You couldn't tie Oswald to the rifle at all. And then you ask yourself about the whole Heidel ID. Well, then it's only when people like William Westbrook all of a sudden get into the picture and start talking about this Heidel ID after the fact. If you look at their first statement, and I forgot the FBI agent who was with him, same thing. Not a word, not a peep about an extra ID. Do you know what? If Oswald had that fake ID in the possession, do you think during the first day of interrogating, and he's had he had 4 interrogations, do you think no one would actually ask about the fact that he had a second ID in his wallet with his photo on it?
Well, that's pretty surprising because they even asked about him going to Mexico City, which I think the
That was
FBI.
Hosty.
Yeah,
Hosty asked that.
Hosty asked that. Well, when Hosty was asking him questions in the first interview, I can read you what the draft says right here. He said he asked him if he'd ever been to Russia. He told him yes, he had been there for 3 years. He asked him if he had written to the Russian embassy, and he said he had. This man became very upset and arrogant with Agent Hosty when questioned him, accused him of accosting his wife 2 different times. When Agent Hosty attempted to talk to this man, he would hit his fist on the desk. I asked Oswald what he meant by accosting his wife when he was talking to Mr. Hosey. He said Mr. Hosey mistreated his wife 2 different times when he talked with her, practically accosted her. Mr. Hosey also asked Oswald if he had been to Mexico City, which he denied. During this interview, he told me that he had gone to school in New York and in Fort Worth, Texas, that after going into the Marines, finished his high school education. I asked him if he won any medals for rifle shooting in the Marines. He said he'd won the usual medals. I asked him what his political beliefs were, and he said he had none, but that he belonged to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And then when he asked him if he had a disregard for President Kennedy, which I found was interesting, he said, or if there was a reason why he wanted Kennedy out, if there was some type of motive that he had for trying to find a way of shooting the Kennedy, he goes, what would it matter? Johnson's no different. And he like, so you kind of start piecing together a little bit, like what would his motive be for shooting Kennedy? If it was to kill Kennedy to get him out of office because he was doing bad things, then you could see motive there. But then he was like, if Johnson's no different, he would just do the same thing. So in his view, the way this guy's describing Oswald, it's like, okay, well then why would he shoot Kennedy if he knows another person's just going to replace them? And also, how the hell do they know about the Mexico City information if they weren't already surveilling him? So it's like you get obviously things that start to leak out a little bit.
The Mexico City information is basically information that Hosty obtained just before he started joining Bookout to go and talk with Oswald, interrogate Oswald at that point. Hosty did not talk directly to Oswald. He spoke through Will Fritz. And afterwards, they realized that they shouldn't have, they made it sound like a faux pas, that Hosty should have kept his mouth shut about Mexico City, because he had basically seen the information prior the interrogation, just before, and therefore he brought that up. There's, yeah, that's pretty much it regarding to that with Hosty.
Can I ask, what are your guys' information, Paul? Feel free if this is coming up in your research, but with Gordon Shanklin, how much weight do you put up behind his corrupted activities at all? Paul, I don't know if you've come across some of his work, but obviously
Not too much, no.
he was
I know of him. He ordered Hosty to get rid of the note that Oswald apparently left left in early November, warning of the FBI harassing his wife. That's all I know about Shanklin.
Yeah, I know Shanklin through the Hosty matter. The note, of course, as mentioned, and just that he was his supervisor. He was his superior.
Now, was Hosty
yeah.
there for all the interrogations, or was he
No,
there just for the first
only the
one?
first one. Then he was pulled out because, well, apparently he started to talk about Mexico City, and because the thing is that Hosty had a file on Oswald. And because of that, Bookout was made to wait, because Bookout was actually the liaison between the FBI and the DPD. So, and he had to wait for Bookout because Bookout had the dossier on him, on Oswald. So then when Hosty goes in and they have that interview, they make the call. And then I don't know what happened, but one thing is for certain, Hosty doesn't return. Hosty is basically being called back into the office. I mean, he stays a bit longer to take the notes of Oswald's evidence possession. And then photographed early in the evening about through the window of the Dallas police robbery and homicide, where he's talking with Bill Alexander. And there's a picture of him where he's standing on this with a newspaper on his hip, which is basically one of the headlines in the afternoon editions. So early evening, around 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, he's being photographed again, being there at the DPD. Yeah, that's my bit.
You know, with Oswald and the evidence that was found at Ruth Payne's house, the first time they went there, they didn't find anything. At least there's nothing that was of substance. But then the second time they go back, they found the rifle, they found the note, they found a bunch of evidence. They took a lot of things there that even some of the stuff necessarily wasn't even Oswald's. Could have been Michael Payne's and some of Ruth Payne's belongings that she testified to. But still in the first interrogation on the first day before he's put in the jail around midnight. It's noted right here in the draft. I showed the rifle to Marina Oswald, and she could not positively identify it, but said that it looked like the rifle that her husband had and that he had been keeping in the garage at Miss Payne's house in Irving.
That's total lie.
Yeah, well, we know that from the HSCA. She didn't know the difference between a rifle and a shotgun, because this
and
is
the
what
fact
happens.
that she didn't recognize it, but then this is where Fritz basically eggs it on a bit more. He just adds on, which isn't true. It's the same about wearing the pistol. You know how boys do, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
That's not Oswald.
Well,
he wouldn't respond like that. And Miss Frasley just whacked it in there.
It states right here, it says, after this, I questioned Oswald further about the rifle, but he denied owning a rifle at all and said that he did have a small rifle some years past. But then he asked him if he owned a rifle in Russia, and he said, no, you can't buy a rifle in Russia. You can only buy shotguns. Now, that would completely agree with what the HSCA did when they interviewed Marina, and she couldn't tell the difference between a rifle and a shotgun. So maybe what she was describing as him owning a rifle was really owning a shotgun. But after this interview, after these questions were asked, after the first interview, when they went back to Ruth Payne's house, because all this was going on, they were still investigating, they were doing all this search and stuff. They went in there, and that's when they found the rifle in Ruth Payne's garage. So they could have used that after that questions and all that was documented, and just went there and, oh, look, we found a rifle in a garage. So either he's lying or they added that evidence in there. I mean, there's a really weird thing. The only evidence they could find on that whatever that blanket, apparently, not that they found a rifle there, but the blanket where their rifle was allegedly wrapped in, was his pubic hair. That's the evidence that he had. That's not a lie. That's not bullshit. That's in there. That is in their documentation. It's the only link they had to Lee Harvey Oswald, was that there was that in that blanket. So I'm just saying, there's a lot of things where the first interrogation.
What did Oswald do with that blanket?
Probably slept in it, man.
But didn't they search him again just before he started the lineups on the first day, and that's when they found live rounds in his pocket, and the transfer.
This one's priceless. This one's priceless. So Oswald gets arrested at the Texas Theater. Now they just basically manhandling him right away into a car that gets photographed, etc., etc. Then they drive straight over to DPD. Oswald gets frisked on that ride, first of all, because they get his wallet out. Okay, that's the first thing. Then when they drop him off, also that's footage is all there. They go past through the car, come out the elevator, go through past the corridors, and then past Billy Lovelady, who's sitting there already, and they basically put him in the holding cell there and then. But Charles Truman Walker in his HSCA statement goes, "Oh, I didn't trust it, blah, blah, blah. So I searched him real good." So he searches him again. Now, this is standard police procedure. You frisk the guy, you want to know. You arrest him, you frisk him. So now I have two statements where they say they frisked him. All right? And then Oswald, after his first interrogations for the Helen Markham lineup, they go in there, and lo and behold, what do Richard Sims and Elmer Boyd find? Yeah?
The transfer.
Five bullets and the bus transfer. Now, I could
in
easily
pristine
say
condition.
The bus, well, it wasn't that pristine, actually. It did have creases in it. But the bus ticket, I could understand if that wasn't felt during a pat down. All right? That's because it's just a flimsy bit of paper. And, I can say that. But 5 bullets in your front pocket, and then while you're sitting down, they don't touch you there to see whether you have live ammo in your pockets? That would be the clumsiest thing of the DPD, those two detectives, or that detective and that patrolman. They're basically making rookie mistakes like that. It should have cost them their jobs, because lo and behold, they find the ticket, and it's like, Boyd found it on one side and Sims found it on the other. Like they were sharing basically. Like, well, I got this and he got that. All right, cool, because I was doing that. So hold on a minute. So we got two so either those two are the biggest amateurs that you can deal with, yeah, or those 5 bullets are inserted into the evidence as being part of Lee Harvey Oswald.
Mm. And at the same time, Westbrook's telling Gerald Hill that Oswald has admitted to being a communist. He's already done that, and that he lived in Russia, that he had the dishonourable discharge. So Westbrook's already starting the stories.
How about to say, in his second interrogation, he defines what type of Marxist he is, and apparently they noted that he stated it 3 times. Like, they made it a point to note what type of Marxist he was. That he wasn't Leninist. He was a certain specific type, and he obviously mentioned his radio interview as well too in that interrogation. Now, which interrogation out of the 4 is the most interesting to you, Bart?
The first one.
Because it reveals the Mexico City and the other stuff like that?
No, Mexico City I don't give a hoot about. I basically care about his alibi, because that's where it happens, and they just destroy the whole thing. This is where the second floor lunchroom encounter was invented. Fritz was in, and he went to Bill Decker just before he came back to the DPD. Now, why did he have to meet Bill Decker in person to talk to him man to man instead of a phone call? Could have just done the same job there and then. Well, that's for something else for next conspiracy hour, but you just have all these elements where you just ask yourself, hold on a minute, man, what's going on here? And Fritz didn't take any notes. He made the notes afterwards. Sean Murphy thought back then in 2013 thought that Fritz copied Bookhout's notes. I've never seen Bookhout's notes. Maybe they're still around. Who knows? And who knows? But there's plenty of evidence that basically the first interrogation is pivotal in destroying Oswald's alibi and basically make him come back with that second floor lunchroom encounter to show that he came from down on the 6th floor. And even if you look at the evidence itself and you go like, it can't be because of that door, that already just makes a mockery of the whole scenario, the door and the closing mechanism. It's just makes a mockery. And also the fact when they start talking about, well, where were you standing and where was he standing? Well, I was just leaning in. I opened the door and I was leaning in. Yeah, well, you were leaning in because there's only 5 feet of space in that whole enclosure. And then Oswald's supposed to be standing there right in the door opening, and then Baker there with his gun drawn on Oswald as such. And then you get the story afterwards where basically Oswald with his coat goes through the second floor office to go downstairs. Now, why would Oswald go through the second floor office? Because when he'd come out the lunchroom, all he had to do is turn left and walk down the corridor and turn left again and be on the top of the stairs and could just go down. Instead of that, he's being fingered and basically saying like, oh, but I saw him shortly after that because I was in there and I saw Oswald come past with a Coke and I said, did you hear about the shots and blah, blah, blah? And he didn't say anything and he just went out. So Oswald must have been in a rush. Where did he guzzle that Coke down? Because that's another thing nobody saw him doing. Nobody. But the best bit is when you have Mrs. Robert Reed, who did this testimony, like what I just explained, is basically refuted by Geneva Hine. Geneva Hine was from 12:25 to 12:35 in that office by herself. She left for a brief moment to knock on the door, but didn't see anybody come in. When she came back, the office was still empty. She didn't see Mrs. Robert Reed and Joe Molina and a handful of others come in as a group 25 minutes after the assassination itself. Yet Mrs. Robert Reed claimed she was there in a minute or two after the assassination. She'd gone up there. Didn't happen. Total rubbish. You look at the statements as well. The first thing, they put an insert of a Coke. They have to insert it because she didn't write it if they wanted her to do it. It's just a joke. The whole thing, the evidence just shows that she was lying. And you know what, Mrs. Robert Reed? She was Roy Truly's secretary. Why do you think Mrs. Carolyn Arnold is quiet? She was Ockus Campbell's secretary. You don't shit where you eat. You don't start flapping out and be a hero.
I don't know. If you're Arnold, what ended up banging his secretary or maid, right? And had an illegitimate kid. It works out sometimes. All right. Now, hold on. I want to get to the second interrogation here because on the second interrogation, apparently we have Agent Robert Nash, 4 Sorrels, and then we have Bookout again. Was there anyone that was present throughout all the interrogations? Like, was the one officer that was there throughout all 4 of them, or was it just an interchange?
There are... Fritz did 3 that day, but there's one more, and I forgot his name. And this guy knew Russian. I just have to look this up quickly. Sorry.
Because I still want to get to the interrogation with Roger Craig. Where obviously...
Oh, that one. That's the second one.
Okay.
That's the second interrogation where Bill Alexander is also walking in at that point. And let me just look this up, just so we're...
Because in the second interrogation...
While you're doing that, Bart, I'll just back up what you said earlier about Roger Craig. There were other witnesses that saw a man running down from the book depository to get into the station wagon. So, everyone, two men that were driving down Elm Street, one was employed by the other, and they had to stop suddenly because this station wagon had just pulled over very quickly to pick up this man that was running down from the book depository. So that's two corroborating witnesses there. And Helen Forrest and James Pennington, they saw the same thing. They were in Dealey Plaza on that side of, between Elm Street and the corner of the book depository. They saw a man running down as well, so it definitely did happen. So when Craig got in and saw and told his story and got in as far as Fritz's office to say what he saw, he got the surprise of his life when he saw Oswald in there.
Just because there was
That was the man.
just because there was a conflict on our last one we did, he didn't actually sit into the interrogation part. Did he just look through the window of the giant glass that was there and then I
No,
guess okay.
Craig said he walked in. And you know what? This is what in my book. Bookout wrote a report where he said he came in at, I think, at the top of my head, 18 minutes past 5, something like that. Not 5:15, not 20 minutes past 5, 18 minutes past 5. Bookout made a report that Roger Craig walked into that office where Oswald was being interrogated. Fritz lied through his rotten teeth about the whole thing. And Craig basically recognizes, you know what another great thing is about Craig? Craig started talking to the Dallas Times Herald. And the next day in the first morning edition, of course, the front page is all about the assassination. But there's Roger Craig's story taking up a massive chunk on that front page. And that's the morning edition. So for me, that leads to credibility and that leads to proper evidence.
Well, that and they threatened him with his job, said if he kept talking about
that was all afterwards because he wouldn't shut up.
Yeah.
They basically told him to shut up.
And that's 3 attempts on his life and then one final.
Yeah, the intimidation. You know what? If you look at the intimidation that happened with the witnesses overall and how people were scared then and are still scared now.
Yeah, they're still scared.
These people are still scared because look at that whole thing about that movie that came out a month ago, the extra assassination footage. And these people buried it underneath their house because they were scared that basically people were coming for it.
It was a problem for Tom Samoluk of the ARRB when he was receiving footage. I think even with the Cooper film, he said that he slept with it under his pillow just because after a while he was getting pretty paranoid. He said he showered with it too. He had it in the sink while he was taking a shower, which I thought was really interesting. He's probably more conspiratorial, and he mentioned it in our last group one I did with him and Judge Thunheim, just because he's not involved in the government anymore. He could probably be a little bit more free than his boss, he said. But he had more skeptical views about the whole lone nut assassin thing. But there becomes a thing even with the second interrogation. Now, the Roger Craig one, is that the second one? You said it was the second one. Is that the second one?
Yeah, roughly the second one. The second one starts at 10 to 5, give or take. And Craig was there. He walked in.
In the second one, they also discussed what we mentioned earlier about the long package that was carried in to the TSBD. When they were asked about that, it says, we found from the investigation the day before that when Oswald left home, he was carrying a long package. He usually went to see his wife on weekends, but this time he had gone on Thursday night. I asked him if he had told Buell Wesley Frazier why he had gone home a different night and if he had told him anything about bringing in some curtain rods. He denied it. During this conversation, he told me he reached his home by cab and changed both his shirt and trousers before going to the show. Now, Buell Frazier said that he was carrying a long package. Is it possible, which they do mention in this report, that they might be mistaking or misremembering one of their days? The day that Buell Frazier apparently saw him with a long package could have been a different night.
One of the TSBD workers saw Oswald come in, and he wasn't carrying anything.
Package.
So,
because that's why I wanted to stress the importance of these
Frazier
interrogations.
was filling his pants as well. Same thing, no disrespect, no judgment, but almost anyone else would have. The amount of force coming down on him, being arrested by Irving police, then being picked up by Rose and Stovall, then taken to DPD, have people interrogate him harshly because they know that Oswald was having rides with Frazier, of course, because how else would they know that? So Oswald must have told them. And they basically start really harshly interrogating. And at some point, Fritz, good old Will Fritz, walks in with a pre-made statement. Now, what kind of justice are we talking about with a pre-made statement when the evidence isn't even put in front of you and so forth, and for you to basically confess to a crime that you have absolutely no business with or ever had any business with?
He was only 19 as well.
Exactly. So think about that. 19 years old. I bet he was filling his pants. He had no legal representation at all. And then you've got this enormous force of DPD coming at you, talking like you. Look, the the robbery and homicide squad was regarded as an elite unit. They had their own signature hats that most of them wore, the white
Yeah.
ones. And on top of that, they were known for beating people up.
Well, hey, they made the
And by
drivers
the
and
way,
other. Hold
this is
on, they
no
made.
accusation
This
to
is
Dallas,
important. Yeah, I know
please.
this is important though. They made other people that weren't even involved, that were part of like public safety people that were driving the motorcade limousines to be identified. They made them wear those hats. The driver of the follow-up car, where Vice President Johnson and his wife were in, that driver, he was asked to wear that. He was told to wear that. That wasn't his own hat that he brought from home. He was given that hat to wear to identify certain individuals that would be marked with the Dallas police. So that just brings credence to what you're saying. But I mentioned this earlier, and I kind of want to read it word for word just so it's kind of accurate. But it was on 9:30 a.m. on the morning of November 24th. Oswald was brought to, I guess this is from Fritz's notes, was brought to Fritz's office, but this is where he asked, some of the federal officers asked Oswald if he thought Cuba would be better off since the president was assassinated. To this, he replied that he felt that since the president was killed, that someone else would take his place, perhaps Vice President Johnson, and that his views would be probably largely the same as those of President Kennedy. So I just wanted to mention that because I had mentioned that earlier, and you're all kind of looking at me like, what? Kennedy being the same as Johnson. But obviously, when we get starting towards the ending of when Oswald's going to be ready for the transfer, Jesse Curry gives the okay that it's fine for Oswald to go out there. They had pushed the cameras back in the basement, and other people had been pushed across the street. Now, when it comes to certain individuals besides Jesse Curry that had involvement with the Dallas police, where it's corrupted activities or just the slaying of Oswald. In your minds, do you guys have any names that particularly stick out, like Fritz? Any others that you would see as giant problems when it comes to obfuscation of the truth, or anything that would be seen as like an ethical manner of how you're supposed to conduct an investigation? I think the point we always usually mention is the fact they could have brought a stenographer from any of the reporters or camera, or anything. They could have brought anything, type of recording device to do that, but that wasn't exactly what they did back then, apparently. So we're relying off notes. Even at the bottom of this report, it says, in the aftermath of this report, we understand that these are all from rough notes in memory, and it is entirely possible that some of these questions that are put into this draft could have been asked in a separate interview from another that is indicated in this report. So there's obviously people just filling in stuff, and we're going off people, what they said, and kind of not really hearsay, but they just put it in note form. But when we're looking at severe corruption and clear evidence that there was something else going on here, we had mentioned a few about Mexico City and others, but in your guys' mind, who do you think would be the best evidence of corrupted activities in the Dallas police besides Jesse Curry? We slammed him enough in the last episode. But any other officers is the best evidence, and then any officers that revealed certain activities of other officers that would give evidence or credence to corrupted activities. I used a lot of the reserved officers.
Jim Lavelle is a great example. Contradicted his own Warren Commission testimony, and his own statement didn't say anything about him interrogating Oswald. He lied about that. He said he interrogated Oswald before he was taken away. It's not true. It was Richard Stovall and Gus Rose who interviewed Oswald for about 15 minutes. Also, he stated in his Warren Commission interview, said his statement in his testimony, he said, I didn't have any dealings with him. He is photographed when Oswald is right in front of the Robbery and Homicide Bureau. There's a picture of Oswald talking to the press. And then there is, of course, Lavelle was part of that last interrogation before he was transported to be killed by Jack Ruby. So Lavelle is definitely somebody looking into. Elmer Boyd as well, although I think like Elmer Boyd to me is one of the most decent ones out there. But I doubt he would say one bad word about Fritz, because you know what? It's just the way it was. So, that's how they'll go. That's how they apologize for it. It's just the way it was. was. So, and those are different times anyway. Thank God they're different times. We now have of the FBI. You know what? I'm speculating about this, but Booker, by putting that note into his file and give those papers to the ARB, he gave researchers the opportunity to go, hey, what about this? What about that and these notes? Because when I found that note, I managed to basically decipher the first note of the interrogation notes by Hosty, and these are flipbook notes inside pocket, what the significance meant after looking at the written pre-statement of Hosty on the back of that Dallas PD affidavit paper. And I was like, oh, that rhymes with that. That rhymes with that. The first three items in that statement, that pre-report, coincide exactly with what's in the flip book. And then you start basically realizing, okay, that means such and such, and that comes from that. All right, okay.
Anyone for you, Paul?
It's probably easy to talk about. Well, I mean, in terms of the shooting of Oswald, I think it was a very contained deal, a very contained setup, but the DPD could never have been relied to investigate on itself and how it handled the security preparations. I think the way Jack Revel, I think he did his best to run that investigation as thoroughly as he could have, and he was the one that identified some of the officers to undergo lie detector tests for out of suspicions that he had or that the investigation brought up in terms of their actions around Oswald's shooting. But Lavelle, I'm with you, Bart, on Lavelle. But the thing that makes me laugh the most is that he, during his Warren Commission, I don't know if you saw this, but he lays out perfectly how well executed Ruby's transfer from City Hall to the county jail was. It was perfect because Curry wasn't involved in it. Decker wasn't involved in it. Fritz literally rang ahead and said, I'm bringing got a couple of guys in the car with me. We're going to drive down Main Street ramp. We'll wait at the bottom and you just bring Ruby. Don't tell anyone. We'll just drive him straight to county jail. And it went perfectly. Textbook transfer, how they should have done it with Oswald. But of course, they didn't. They had to make it the big song and dance. And, we've talked about Curry's, adoration for the press and needing them to, needing to have them see as much as they could, to give the people what they wanted and to show that the DPD weren't mistreating, this prisoner when they were doing everything to do just that. So I think it's probably easier to answer your question to talk about who probably the most honest or clean DPD were, because as we've probably covered over during this conversation, a lot of people fell into line after the fact.
And a lot of people guarding the basement were reserve officers too, right? They weren't main people, so that's lack of security if you really talk about having your best guys on the protection detail.
Yeah, there were 12 reserve officers in the basement, and felt pretty close.
I think everybody worked long hours that weekend, so I'm not surprised that they had reserve officers, because I think I got a schedule of all the police officers from that department who were working that day or not, half a day or a day and a half, blah, blah, blah. I saw the whole timesheet from Ian Griggs years ago, and it just showed everybody was called into work, and everybody was working like 12 to 16 hours minimum. So
yeah,
I'm
that's
not
fair.
surprised.
And they even, your ranking reserve officers were even starting to call in, more reserves the night before, Saturday the 23rd, because, when Curry broadcasted when Oswald would be transferred, they clearly knew that they needed to get as many men in, apparently, as possible. But then you hear stories of that George Spears, who was off duty, and he was, he was a cab driver for press, interstate press. So Yeah, people were working hard in a few different ways that weekend. Yeah.
I wanted you ever hear the name Jimmy Hopkins? He was a reserve officer, but he was there for 4 hours from like I guess it was like 8 to like midnight or something like that in the jail. And he was the one I mentioned earlier about Oswald laying down, eyes closed, just sleeping. When he was there, didn't say a word, didn't even take his feet off the bed or anything like that. They didn't touch the floor. But he mentioned Jesse Curry in his oral history interview. I know you don't rely on him too much, but some of the little detail stuff I like. But he mentioned that he didn't think Curry was a bad guy, but he think he was too obsessed with what the media needed to know and was too focused on that to be able to do his job effectively. And I think that's what we've discussed in previous, that obviously the unhealthy relationship or the relationship, whatever was going on with the Dallas police and the media was obviously a problem when it came to security concerns in the basement. I mean, even stuff like Buell T. Bedingfield and then Arthur E. Eves, if you've ever heard of them, they let Oswald place two phone calls in the jail. One was to home and one was to New York City. I don't know. We don't have anything, but it's on the call logs. They have that documented too. They signed the name and everything. But Oswald placed the call to New York City. Whether that was John Apt or someone, I have no clue. But it was never defined, and nothing ever arose out of that. Just said he placed two phone calls, one for home and then one for New York City. So there's obviously a lot that was going on in the case. It's kind of what I wanted to have you guys on here about it because there's a lot that gets said about Oswald and he gets painted a certain way. It goes back to what I mentioned about, I guess it must be his last interrogation, but when Oswald just asked for a change of clothing and they went up and picked out the best, one of his, whatever his sweaters, I don't know what do you want to call it, but cardigan, let's call it that. But they let him, whatever he was shot in, they let him, or they picked out that for him. I mean, they really paint him from the Warren Commission standpoint as someone that's either mentally unstable or a cold-blooded killer. And I think if you look at some of this revealed, or not even revealed documents, but just documentation from the Dallas police and others, you get a different picture. Even statements from witnesses, which I know they say, oh, you can't trust witness testimony, but based on a lot of these things, it does not fit what the Warren report wanted them to kind of be in a way. And I wanted to understand from your guys' point of view, what has been the most helpful in documentation. Obviously, I've used Malcolm Blunt's archives, and I'm very thankful for Bart for putting a lot of those documents online. You've done the JFK research community a great service. But when it came to FBI files, yeah, think about FBI files, anything Dallas police. I've noticed the Texas history site has been very helpful in at least revealing some statements from officers or just some statements from people that, like I said, they weren't interviewed by the Warren Commission. So you're not finding an FBI document on.
Carolyn Arnold wasn't interviewed by the Warren Commission.
Lots of people weren't.
Yeah. No,
Someone commented after all these clips I've done, and they were like, what the hell does this have to do with the assassination? I'm like, why the fuck does the Warren Commission have it in there? I don't know. That just, you're proving my point that it was a load of shit.
Wasn't there something about Ruby's mother-in-law and the dental bill?
Yeah, they had her mother's dental records in there. And I think it was Mark Lane said this would have nothing to do with the assassination, even if Ruby had bit Oswald to death.
Paid. It's all filler. All filler.
So what
the
would
Mary
you guys?
Farrell Foundation
Mary
is
Farrell.
very, very good. That's where I found a lot of them. Most of the FBI documents, which for my part at the moment has been around the Oswald shooting. So that's been very, very useful. You can drill down to a person, all the documents related to a single person. So statements they made to the DPD, the FBI, Warren Commission, even the HSCA. It's all grouped in there really neatly. So Mary Farrell Foundation for me.
Me? I'm still, although I've dug up a lot of stuff, I'm still digging. I'm still looking at things. And, I only can tell you the things that I found out and how things happened, or based on the documentation. I tell you the story of how it went. And as far as I'm concerned, this puzzle that I'm working on, I don't think it will ever get better than, the jumbo jet that was basically exploding over Lockerbie, and they put the whole thing back together. So that's how I see what I'm working with. That type of construction in a puzzle. There are gaps. There's unevenness. It's not smooth. It's not, certain things are open to interpretation or speculation as such. I try to steer away as much as possible from that and basically use the documentation to put things together in such a way that if you want to refute me, then you got to do better than just your fucked up opinion and your shitty thoughts and beliefs, because I really don't give a toss. But you know what would help? Evidence. When you say, hey, I've got an interview, such and such. And then again, you got to ask yourself, what's the worth, the value of this evidence? Why? Because before that guy does that interview, did he do any statements under oath? Was there an affidavit taken? Did he do Warren Commission testimony and so forth? Because I've seen plenty of instances where lawmen, because they're just being interviewed by a press guy on camera, they can say whatever the fuck they want because there's no law against lying at all. He can just do whatever he wants and he can contradict. And that's Lavelle is an excellent example of that. Basically twisting things around and making look self taller than he actually was. Of course he was there, but he made his role a lot bigger than he should have. And that's why he's also so much in the picture because, hey, oh, you're the guy who stood next to Oswald when he got shot, blah, 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 blah. That wasn't apparently not good enough. He had to basically make the story and say, hey, I was also I interrogated him 2 days prior.
Have you seen his oral history interviews? They're amazing. He starts off the first 2 minutes literally going, I don't believe conspiracy. There was no conspiracy. By the way, did I tell you there's no conspiracy? I'm like, one more time for the people in the fucking back, man.
And he didn't have that joke with Oswald on the way down in the elevator, saying, "I hope if someone takes a shot at you, Lee, they're as good a shot as you are." That didn't happen.
That's
It was
bullshit.
silence.
Because what's his name, Graves, the other officer, couldn't remember anything being said in the elevator as such. And on top of that, Oswald was not an instigator. If you look at Oswald's psychiatric reports while he was in New York in 1953. It all says that he's not instigating anything. He will answer when asked. And otherwise, he doesn't walk up to you and say, hey, how's it going? Did you see the game? Blah, blah, blah. Doesn't do any of that stuff. And Greg Parker always thought that he had a mild form of Asperger's. And that's possible because also these people are a little bit in their shell and don't really come out unless they're spoken to. And like I said in the beginning, the New Orleans tapes are actually great examples of that. He doesn't volunteer anything. He just gives you the answer to that particular question. So, you know what? He must have wound up the interrogators so much that they just couldn't get a proper answer out of him. And then call him arrogant. That's what they always said. Lavelle, oh, he was arrogant. He was arrogant. No, he wasn't arrogant. He just answered the question that you asked, and that's
I believe with Hosty he was. I'd be pissed too if some dude was going at my wife a couple of times.
No, that's also exaggerated. That whole thing about him slamming the fist, it comes in all kinds of, how do I say, levels of thickening the story and slamming the table. Of course, he said, hey, I know you. You've been talking to my wife. And before you know it, you've got another, hey, us boys carrying guns like we do, blah, blah, blah. It just gets added on and on. How did they interrogate back in those days? There were no audio tapes, recordings.
One sat behind you, and then one asked you in front.
Exactly, yeah. One sat behind you, and then one sat in front asking the questions. And then when it came to court, the guy who sat behind him was basically just sitting like, yeah, that's how it went. That's what he said, blah, blah, blah. You know, no lie detector test, no record. Fritz was notorious for not taking any records.
Well, I remember you telling me that about someone sitting behind them, and I actually was watching an oral history interview with Bob Welch. I don't remember if he was from the Dallas Time Herald or the Dallas Morning News. I think it's the Dallas Morning News. but he had mentioned the way Fritz interrogated people. And they asked him, was like, you know, Fritz during the interrogation, he didn't make any notes or do anything like that, or did he leave anything of value? And Bob Welch was like, Fritz didn't really need all that. He had a great way of talking to people. He would sit him down, he'd get his answer from his man. And then like he explained like the way that Fritz would interrogate certain individuals, which only backed up a lot of what we've discussed in the past, Bart, but also for a kind of a question for you, Paul. I mean, some of the reporters' statements, obviously that night, I mean, have you found any of them that really side with conspiracy? Because a lot of the ones I'm seeing from oral history interviews have agreed to not really conspiracy, but there's a question for them about one aspect of the case. Bob Welch he literally pointed at the camera and said, anybody in the future that's watching this, you want to know a good area to research, why don't you research the Walker shooting? Because one thing that's baffled me is how could a man miss a guy sitting at a desk from a window and somehow be able to hit the president from a 6th floor up and, you know, while the car is moving? I'm going to pause it for Bart real quick.
The media is so hard to really kind of gauge what they truly thought about, you know, the goings on at DPD that weekend, at City Hall that weekend. My focus is more around the Oswald shooting, and there were, I count that there were at least 40 in the basement when Oswald was brought out, and there's precious little detail from any of them, even in the oral history interviews after the years. But Seth Cantor, he obviously knew Ruby from a few years before JFK, and he wrote a couple of good books in the late 70s, and he comes close to you know, to delving a little bit more into, you know, the plot that involved Ruby to shoot silence Oswald. But apart from him, I cannot find anyone else. You just get articles that were fired out very quickly at the time, and then it's like there's a vacuum. There is just very little, because I think the bodies started to pile up, these mysterious deaths, Bill Hunter, Jim Kurther, and you know, after that meeting at Ruby's apartment on the night of Oswald's shooting, you know, I think people started to get very scared. Dorothy Kilgallen, yeah, was another you know, suspicious death. So I think
wasn't Tom Howard shot by a police officer that was apparently playing
No, that was
Bill Hunter.
That was Bill Hunter. Yeah, Howard just died of very suddenly of a heart attack. Yeah. But he died. It was a sudden death as well. But yeah, so I just think you know, but people were just scared into just going along with the main with the narrative, and have stuck with giving very, very little detail. It's not even clear in their statements even back then of where they were standing when Oswald was shot. So I just think they've towed a very, very strong line ever since.
Bart?
Well, in my book, I outline systematically and chronologically what's going wrong while Oswald's in custody, and how his role is basically made to look like he's the assassin of the president. First, of course, they mark him as the killer of Tippit. Hey, who wants to defend a cop killer? You know, that has a serious effect on his colleagues. Because the first thing you do as a person in those days, at that time, in that city, in that area, in the South, you barely know him. Look at Ruby. Ruby is a great example.
Well, from all the people's testimonies, you couldn't even tell if Oswald was in the fucking Texas School Book Depository on that day. All the people were like, I don't recall seeing him. I'm like, did he even show up to work? Because apparently that punch clock was BS. They said that punch clock, nobody really cared or really...
No, nobody used it.
Yeah.
Because there were set times for arriving and fucking off for lunch and coming back and going home.
God, what a life
to
Ruby, have that job.
The same thing of denials. Because everyone inside DPD knew who Ruby was. And then when it comes down to it, it's like, oh no, didn't see him, don't know about him, I saw him once coming in with coffee and donuts and blah, blah, blah. Distance yourself. Oswald,
No different whatsoever. The second, he's basically marked as a cop killer. What? Lee? Cop killer? Oh no, I barely had any interactions with him. I barely saw him and so forth. He always kept to himself. This, that, and the other. The loner. Yeah. The strange guy. Then it comes out the guy is a commie agitator. 45 minutes after his arrest, it's already out there. You know? And then also, a lot of people say, well, why do you say that Oswald's on the steps? Because nobody saw him on the steps. And I'm going, yeah, you're right. You're 100% right. But did anyone see Bill Fraser on the steps? Did anyone see Joe Molina on the steps? Did anyone see Carl Edward Jones on the steps? Did anyone see Roy Edward Lewis standing in the doorway of the landing of the steps? No one saw them. Either black, Hispanic, or been into contact with police. Marked right there and then. Oh, did you see it? Well, I saw him. Otis Williams, who I recently discovered in a Darnell film, didn't even say that he was down there with Joe Molina. And they worked together for 16 years. And Molina was picked up in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. They basically tossed his house. And that was Jack Raffle, or was it Ganaway? Together with Bill Alexander, some heavyweights. Yeah, we're going to find out with this commie bastard. We're going to take care of this. And they go in there and they toss his house. They wake them all up, put them in one room, toss the house, and then go and find one thing which says mia comadre instead of them thinking like, that's my comrade. That's commie language. That's the only thing they can find. Other than that, they find nothing. And then they tell him to come back in the next day at 10 o'clock. And they also treat him like dirt, complete dirt. They make him sit there and wait all day. And that's funny because those statements from Molina, they're very, very telling when it comes to the Roy Truly going in and actually staying on that floor. Not going up to the stairs with Baker together. Staying on that floor. Oh, gee, how's that working out? The next day when, of course, that whole thing just disappears. It doesn't have a date on it. It only comes back later and basically said, typed from memory because he didn't want to sign the statement. Well, that's really funny because 6-7 hours prior, he signed a statement with the DPD. But the second statement doesn't show up until Feb or March 64. If I then look at the fingerprints, if I then look at palm prints, if I then look at the Heidel ID, if I then look at the termination of his alibi, where he said he was, and so forth. And when none of that is enacted upon, nor is it repeated at some point. August Campbell's observation is not repeated. Carolyn Arnold's is not repeated. You know, all these little things. Roy Truly was overheard by Ken Biffle about it as well. And you just take all these bits and you just go, come on, man. The fix is in. It's just no way to go. And you know what? I don't even blame Dallas for it because if you look at American justice overall, how that went, how cops were in those days, you'd get a beating if you didn't give them the answers they wanted to have.
But
and that didn't matter. If you were in New York,
been to a
LA,
Golden Corral? They're good. You're talking about American justice system, but we got a Golden Corral, dude, that'll knock your socks off. You'll forget about that American justice system real quick.
Hey,
Sorry.
listen, it's really simple. That corruption in police forces isn't just Dallas. It was all over, okay? And it still is. Maybe not as blatant, but it still is. You know, bad cops, they're there. Simple as that. It's like toilet paper. It doesn't go away. It's always going to be there. So, but then that unit, yeah. And you know what? This guy basically, he could just have to talk with a judge and say, don't let this guy go. Now, what captain in the police force has that kind of power where you just call a judge and go, you know, hold this guy's bail? What kind of captain takes a pre-made statement into an interrogation? And the funny thing is that Gus Rose later on is in his documentary about, what's it called, Making a Murderer? And he did the same thing of making a pre-made statement, going to that suspect and go, Here, sign this. Just like that. Now, that's 2 cases where this just comes out in 2 different individuals, but from the same Dallas Police Department. And you go, how many times did they do this? You know, how many times did they get away with that? All these people. Then you look at the justice from, what's his name? The book by Edmund Gray about Henry Wade and how that was done. And you know what? Wade told to keep the evidence in storage so they could check for DNA later on, etc., etc. And they did that. And then there were dozens of people basically exonerated because Dallas police taken a shortcut. Or Dallas DAs basically taking a shortcut. Yeah, and messing around with the evidence and not getting blacks on the jury and this, that, and the other. I'll write all about that in the beginning of my book because I think that setting, what that was like, socially, economic, political, how was that there? Yeah, the Klan was there. The Klan was massive in the 20s, was huge. There was about 10-12% of Dallas that was a member of it. Member of a secret organization. 10%. It's unreal. And I know it's 40 years prior, but you don't think that whole racist element disappears over 40 years? It's all there. So it's still there. It's just more refined. And you have to take all these things into perspective and see how the blacks were treated. The blacks were, you look at the 5th floor guys and the guys who were on the 1st floor, Eddie Piper and the boys upstairs and all that. They are profiled. They take pictures of them. There are no other employees, women or men, Caucasian, having their picture taken. Not one of them. But those 5 black guys, candid camera time. Let's have it. Yeah.
I will say, for someone who says they're tired of talking about it, you sure do know how to talk about it. God damn. I'm kidding.
Well,
gentlemen,
you throw a quarter in me and off I go. Yeah.
Like a claw machine. I know. I really do appreciate the time you've given me to do this podcast. Spotify has a 2-hour limit, so I'm going to put both your guys' links in the description. Paul, I know from your previous episodes, I'm going to toss that link in there when your new book comes out. I'll make sure that goes in there as well, too. And then Bart with Prayer Man. More than a fuzzy picture. Is it a smudge on the lens?
Buy it.
I don't know.
Buy it now.
The smudge on the lens. That's all it is. I'll make sure to link your book in the description and any other links I can find from the DP UK site when you were on it. And some other things as well, too. Guys, seriously, thank you again. And thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for another episode.